Right. I want to wish everyone a good afternoon. My name is Celine Chapman, and I'll be facilitating our policy panel. I am really, really excited for the conversation we're going to have, particularly because I was really struck by how the last panel concluded, really by discussing the strengths and growth edges of the response by regulatory agencies. And so I encourage us all to really keep this in mind as we begin to navigate this conversation. Because as we are all aware, since the train development, there's been much discussion about an appropriate policy response from the Congress to state legislatures to city halls. And the question that really continues to loom large is, how do we prevent another East Palestine? And so, the need for improved rail safety is clear. But one also has wonders if there's other elements that need addressing as well, particularly in light of sort of the thousands of synthetic chemicals that we interact with on a daily basis. Many of these substances have a really significant impact on our public health. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into those topics to see what an expansive and comprehensive policy response look like. And we're really lucky to have a fantastic lineup of speakers to share their insights with us. So with that, I want to sort of turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves and give a brief introduction. And perhaps we can start with Senator Booth.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Oh, thank you.
We got you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and also just including me in this important conversation. Certainly grateful to all of the advocates and the experts and the NGOs and people that really shouldn't have to step into these situations to help residents, and because of the lacking or just the great failure of government, to be honest and blunt. So I just want to say thank you for everyone who's taught me these deficiencies about them, how they impact people, and residents for sharing their story. Back in February, we were for the Senate Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee. I am the minority chairperson of that committee, and we were in Beaver County to have a hearing after the derailment. And as someone who grew up in Western Pennsylvania, obviously from a heartstring perspective, it was difficult to hear. And then also just realizing we have over 5,600 miles of railway in our Commonwealth. And the same rail line that's out west goes right through the borough that my office is in. I used to live in for 8 years and just moved up the street 8 minutes. But still, this could happen anywhere. It just happened in Montgomery County 2 weeks ago. There was a train derailment, and immediately in the morning, I received a phone call from the governor's office to let me know that everything was fine. And I love that statement, especially coming from government, because it turned out to be a rail car that had some sort of toxic content that was tipped, and the valve was in the dirt. And it's like there's never enough information. And so I credit everyone on here for being good question askers. And certainly I don't have good news to deliver about the landscape of Pennsylvania politics in terms of the will of the legislature to address these issues. I think earlier I heard one of the residents, or read it in the chat, about the desperate need for us to make sure we're making the connection for those that don't know. And I admittedly, in the last 5 years I've been in office, certainly didn't know all the things I know now, and I'm still learning, but the connections between the petrochemical industry, their stronghold on the Pennsylvania legislature because of the gas that sits under our state that corporations make billions off of and harm residents. And to hear people not have drinking water and fearful of drinking their water. There's many derailments that happen every day in Pennsylvania in terms of toxic exposure from the fracking and oil and gas industry, cradle to grave. So from drilling wells to extraction to waste disposal, our laws exempt that industry from any accountability. That's the state and federal law, the loophole. So those are things that you would think that even I'm a Democrat, and I have many Democratic colleagues who do not have the political courage to talk about these issues, let alone co-sponsor or sponsor legislation to solve them, Senate been in the Republican stronghold majority for 30 years. So my defense is to amend every bad bill to try to make it better and amend in some of our legislation that would close hazardous waste loopholes, require rail safety, things that can happen at the state level, because often people want to say that's a federal issue, and the state actually has a lot of power to protect its residents. And there is a bipartisan love that's really sick and corrupt, that Pennsylvania's been a legacy pollution state for a reason, because of corporate loyalty by most lawmakers. And that's a campaign finance conversation. And so we're here today because we have a government that has failed to do its job, which is to serve the people. And so there's a battle ahead, but what's the most worthy battle of our lifetime is to try to fight for the right things, right? And so thank you for letting me be a part today of today's event.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Senator, and I appreciate your political coverage, right? Because I think in order to sort of make significant progress, we need to have honest conversations about where we're at and where we need to go. So I really appreciate you bringing that to this space. Next, I'm going to go to Jackie to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jackie Omotalade. I am the Climate Investments National Director for Dream.org. And first and foremost, I would like to say it is just truly an honor to be sitting on a panel with Senator Muth. I previously worked kind of on the state level, and just to see her do battle for good in those hearings with Senator Comita. Sometimes they are the two voices in there fighting the good fight. And every time I hear them, even though I know how the votes are going to go when they do roll call, like they ask the questions that need to be asked. And we all need to have legislators who do that. Most of my work now is on the federal level with a little bit of some states, some key targeted states that are EPA priorities. But just again, Senator Muth, kudos to you for standing up there and asking those very tough questions and holding your colleagues to account. So in my work, again, I work on the federal level with federal agencies in terms of anything that has to do with climate finance and climate investments. So mainly around like the suite of laws that the Biden administration passed to bring funds to both states and local governments and disadvantaged communities. And I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, born and raised.
Thanks, Jackie, and really looking forward to sort of getting your perspective, both from your time working in the state legislature here in Pennsylvania, as well as sort of what the landscape is on the federal level. So really great that you're able to join us. Last but not least, Glenn, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and sort of what perspective you'll bring to our conversation?
Well, in the allotted 5 minutes, I have to introduce myself and talk about RP3. Given what I've heard from the start of this symposium, I'll use some of that time to talk about critical missing information about Norfolk Southern and reserve the rest of my time. Because in just 2 days of National Transportation Safety Board hearings, we learned that the uncontrolled burn of 115,580 gallons of toxic chloride was apparently entirely unnecessary because it had been stabilized by removing the oxygen to prevent polymerization before being loaded into the rail cars and was not at all likely to explode. Norfolk Southern and their contractor were told this by the manufacturer before the release and burn. But this information was withheld from the Unified Command and from the governor. Without being given this vital information, the chief of the local volunteer fire department was told he had 13 minutes to make a final decision because it was getting dark. We also learned that the environmental consultants for Norfolk Southern received a train consist document detailing all the chemicals the train carried just 10 minutes after the crash. Norfolk Southern and their consultant also withheld that critical information from emergency responders for many hours. Remember that Norfolk Southern justified the burn because it claimed the temperature in one car was rising. The NTSB showed a graph demonstrating that the temperature in that rail car was trending down before the burn, and that the safety valves on all 5 cars were working. People asked me, why on earth would Norfolk Southern behave like this and waste 5 tank cars of vinyl chloride? The answer is the burn and release would get the tracks cleared faster and get the freight moving again. That is the priority. That is the mentality. The Chicago to Conway rail yard to Pittsburgh to East Coast refineries rail line is admitted by Norfolk Southern to be the most critical east-west line in its entire system. That line is the most intensively used corridor for transport of hazardous chemicals and volatile oil in North America. You must understand the magnitude of this train line and the value of the traffic. The town, your health, and the cost of cleanup are small potatoes. This railroad is making $1 billion a quarter. They will also be recovering money they spent on you from their insurance company, from the rail and wheel car manufacturers, and from the manufacturer of the vinyl chloride. That last point is an additional reason for the release and burn. You have been used. This one derailment just attracted a little too much attention, but they are counting on not much changing. And you will hear why that's the case from me in a bit. According to whistleblowers, the following poem was routinely scratched into the walls of most Norfolk Southern locomotive. It pretty much says it all. It goes like this: uphill slow, downhill fast, product first, safety last. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm excited because I think if you got anything from this intro is that we're going to have some courageous conversations over the next 50 minutes. And so if you're like me, your brain's already percolating. So if you have questions, please do put those in the chat. We'll make sure to grab those once we get to that portion of our conversation. But for this portion of the conversation, I want to go back to Senator Moof and just ask, as a member of the Pennsylvania State Legislature, you sort of started to talk about some of the difficult dynamics that you face, but how do you think about the policy landscape surrounding these issues? What shape does a comprehensive response look like, particularly one that takes into account the immediate issues of transportation safety, as well as sort of the longer-term issues of public health as it relates to toxic chemicals?
Sure. So I definitely credit those that spoke before me on bringing up some of these important points. Like, in other countries don't operate the way that we do, and many of these substances are banned. And so that's policy point number one for me is, what are we allowing people to be poisoned by? And also even just talking about below level long-term exposure. So just because your house doesn't have X amount of fill in the blank horrible thing, it's not at the limit or the scary limit. There is plenty of science, decades of it, to show that if you are exposed at a constant level over time, you will be impacted. And this isn't, I was called a member of the Green Mafia last week. So that's going to be I'm coining the name. This isn't my Green Mafia opinion. This is me reading decades of other people's research showing that this is what happens. And so if you look at Pennsylvania's history of legacy pollution, where there's been landfills that are since, covered over, suddenly the EPA is back in my own Senate district in the suburbs of Philadelphia, looking at landfills for PFAS and PFOA because they're trying to do a rulemaking. And so I don't deny the difficulty of the goal of changing the way government thinks, because it's how much pollution and toxins can we permit, in a community, versus how do we protect the people that we are here to serve. And so when there is a financial stronghold over government to do this, that's the other policy piece. How do we get money out of politics? Because both sides of the aisle are guilty of voting based on donors and not the people that they represent. And that is probably the most difficult barrier, even in our own Democratic Senate caucus. And it might not be for-profit entities per se, but it may be certain building trade unions that donate big checks to people because they work in the oil and gas industry. And I am the only senator who doesn't take any for-profit related donation. And so it is more difficult to fundraise, but you know, at the end of the day, I'm not there to make friends with people who are corporate loyalists. And so the policy has to come around protection. And to protect, you have to also prevent. So there's a prevention piece, the emergency response piece that happens after something happens. All of these things are doable. And so monitoring health, we should do that. Act 13 in Pennsylvania at one point prohibited physicians from talking to patients about the impacts of living near fracking and oil and gas extraction. We heard earlier from residents who've gone to the doctor, and I'll be candid, after I left Beaver County in February, some of you, like I may have read this, but I got sick on the way home, and I of course can't point to evidence because there's really no way to test for any of this. I was in the Somerset County ER UPMC overnight, and the night before that, before the hearing, I stayed in a hotel near the Pittsburgh airport because I didn't want to stay in Beaver County because the Shell cracker plant was flaring uncontrollably. So I didn't want to stay in a hotel there. And so I thought, well, I'm by the airport. Well, here they were doing fracking and something at the airport. And later there was some water issue. So I had the worst headache of my life that night. I thought I was done for. And so when you hear about having these symptoms and people are challenged on what they're experiencing, these are real things. And I came home, I've gone to neurologists. I was in vestibular therapy for 3 months. And I never had anything like that. I hugged people that were from East Palestine. I talked, I don't know, what could, I'm in Beaver County with a crappy air from the cracker plant. It was a windy day. I don't know. But my whole point is we don't even have trained physicians. And my own doctor was like, I'm gonna be blunt with you. If you were exposed to something, we just have to monitor your symptoms and treat symptoms. There's no way. So it's that prevention piece is so critical. And then if you are impacted, then what are we doing to support people? Do people that were just speaking earlier, what's your healthcare copay? Do you have health insurance? Can you afford the treatment that you now need because you were just living in your community and disrupted by corporate greed? And so those are policy things that just basic public safety. It's not banning anything. It's not this meltdown of gas heads versus not. It's a public safety issue from the worker perspective even. And so I really encourage everybody, we're all in our bubble here. We know these things, to go outside the bubble and talk to people that maybe have some uncomfortable conversations, because some of this is political, but the political is personal, and politics just can make or break each one of our lives. And so sometimes you have to get into the game to change it. And I think that every single Pennsylvanian and every person on this earth deserves protections from these harms that are totally preventable. This isn't, something that's some natural occurrence. This is total bullshit. It's complete negligence by government and by corporate polluters. And I'm going to drop my email in the chat because I did hear, I don't want to forget, Salim, someone mentioned they are still relying on bottled water and they're in Darlington Township, but they're getting it through donations. So I already on the break called the DEP and slightly lost my mind. And they seem to claim that they're not turning anybody away that still needs help, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't represent that side of the state. So I don't know that anyone has my contact information. So I just want to put that in there. If you want to shoot me an email, they said that we'll help anybody who reaches out. So I just want to make sure that any of these families that are impacted, their information gets to the right person.
Well, thank you, Senator. And that's the type of multitasking I want to see from my elected leadership is getting things done as soon as they hear things. And I don't want that to get lost, because I want folks to remember that we have a sitting elected official talking about the importance of getting money out of politics. And so I know you just kind of talked about that in your answer, but that's really, really significant, really, really important, and something that even as we talk about the health elements of this, which is a lot of what we'll cover today, we don't forget that that's a huge component of what we're trying to do. And last I'll say is that if having health protective policies make you part of the Green Mafia, tell me where I can sign up. I'm excited for that. Jackie, I want to come back to you. So one of the many lessons we took from East Palestine is that, you know, environmental health crises really span boundaries and are often across jurisdictions. So in this case, it's Pennsylvania and Ohio. So what opportunities do you see for forging unconventional partnerships to really deliver health protective policy solutions?
Well, I mean, I'm going to build off of what the senator just said in terms of the uncomfortable conversations, which are the ones that we need to have, and holding folks like accountable. And I will just say, for instance, in my work, I was in DC last week doing some advocacy with my team about a whole constituent base from Ohio, from West Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from Missouri, and we're having very difficult conversations with Senator Manchin, Senator Josh Hawley, right, who are not necessarily used to having constituents in their face, talking to them about like the future of the planet, the reliance on like petrochemicals, reliance on fossil fuel, right? So really kind of having those conversations, right, with folks that like live in their district, for some reason they don't believe they're there, and really having them and holding them to task and repeatedly doing so, right? Like power to the people, the power has been in the people and it should be in the people, right? And it is up to people, and government and that work of activism is an active activity, like that is a civil society. And so I encourage people, even when you think you do not have a voice, you absolutely do, and you just have to continue to use it and to exercise it, right? And to hold folks to task. I mean, I witnessed many of those conversations that elected officials, particularly like in Ohio, were having with their constituents post East Palestine. And the thing that really kind of stood out for me was the sound bites they were given when I compared them to what their voting records actually said. And there was a very stark contrast to the lip service that they were giving residents of East Palestine and how they have voted. And I think even to date, they still haven't been held to task for their votes and more recent votes in terms of deregulation, and in terms of policies and laws that do not protect the citizens that they were elected to represent. And I think the residents of East Palestine, just like the residents of Ohio and Pennsylvania, should remember that in future elections.
Yeah, I really appreciate you highlighting that, Jackie, because I think so much of our conversation, political conversation, sort of places people in these narrow boxes, right? And it's really important that we see that, you know, folks are really expansive in their thinking and really look at these issues in a really, really broad way, and that sort of what we think folks might connect to is not necessarily what they might be interested in, and can be much more expansive than that. So thank you.
And the reality is that like we all want clean water and air, right? Like all of us want to have happy, healthy families, like just as a basic like human right. Like we all want to live in a space that is safe and safe from a broad perspective, right? Like that is across party lines. I've yet to meet somebody who's like, I want to drink dirty water. And so what we have to do is make sure, regardless of where we are in terms of like the political spectrum, right? Like be it conservative, be it like far to the left, is to like prioritize that and prioritize that conversations and making sure that we're paying attention to that as opposed to the noise that seeks to divide us. Because if we're divided in terms of just wanting to be safe and healthy, then like corporations win.
And I want to tie on to that, Jackie, because I think like part of this is there is this perception put out by corporate media that things are so divided. And I'll point out that I won a district that was historically not blue. I wasn't supposed to win an election. No one thought I could win, but what won was talking to people where they were at their door. We just knocked doors for 1.5 years. And that's a lot of work. And I had great volunteers to help me get there. But my point is that it's not, we're all not that far apart, right? And this basic issue of public safety, put it with whatever, clean water, adequate, you know, like EMS coverage, like fill in the blank public safety thing. Those are not partisan issues. And so with the people, they're made partisan in the building that I work in, and certainly in DC, I'm sure Jackie can see that, but that they're made partisan there, and they're watered down, and people's lives end up being negotiated off of, right? And so before this, right as the break was hitting, I had a text message with a tweet from David Sirota from The Lever, and he's been covering this derailment stuff pretty heavily. So if you don't follow him on social media, I highly recommend, because it's a lot of in the weeds investigative journalism, but it's honest and it's truth-based. And he tweeted out this whole thing about, you know, how just that, you know, lobbyists have weakened the rail bill in the federal government. So it's garbage now. It's been amended. And now also the latest one is that the corporate cash derails train safety bill, that the oil company whose vinyl chloride poisoned East Palestine gave $2 million to the Senate GOP as lawmakers watered down and stalled proposed reforms. And one of those lawmakers are from Ohio. And so I don't know how to reckon with like being able to look at the people you represent, say you're going to go help them, and then go take a check and then water down your own bill to make it meaningless. Those people need to be voted out of office. And I'm not trying to be political on this, but I want to empower those that feel like they're just a somebody in a little town of wherever, is that as a community, if you educate each other on these realities, that this isn't political, we just need representation in government, and that people should maybe consider stepping up and running for those things and seeking elected office. If someone's not representing you, that isn't fighting for you, then, you know, this is life or death. I mean, that's just the blunt reality of it. Like, that's not trying to be dramatic, but we've heard from everyone on here that's been impacted and knows the research. Like, people have been poisoned in this country for decades, and it's the fact that there's still a denial and effort to cover that up by the government is just utterly unacceptable.
And I would just, again, echo the senator's point that anybody is a somebody, right? Like, anybody can kind of get out there and speak to their neighbors and hold politicians to task. Trust me, like, call in their offices. And I know folks get like tired of doing it, but build your community, right? And it starts in grassroots. I came out of being an organizer, right? And as the senator said, like, the way you win campaigns, like, no matter what people say, digital, all that stuff, is by door to door having conversations with folks who see you as a trusted resource, right? And who sees you as that? The folks in your church, the folks in your synagogue, the folks that you go to, like the grocery store, like, have conversations with them. Because I think that if anything positive can come out of like East Palestine, is the folks' eyes truly get open to the enormous like gaps and inequities in government, and the fact that the power is with the people to change that. But you got to kind of get up and you got to get in that fight and stay in that fight, and get your neighbors, like, sitting down, like you're at the barbecue, whatever's happening, you're at Kennywood, wherever you are, have those conversations and let people know that, like, we are in it together. And like, should be no political divide in terms of clean water, clean air, clean soil, safe places for our kids to play and grow up and be healthy and get old. Like, the goal is to get old and live a happy life.
Yeah, I really appreciate, you know, that exchange that you all are having. You're getting a lot of love in the chat for that. There's one comment from Alice that's saying, you know, yes, we all want clean water and air and have a right to prioritize that. And I want folks to realize that if you're a Pennsylvania resident, which I think everyone on this panel is that that's actually codified in our state constitution. Article 1, Section 27 entitles us to those sort of rights. And so really making sure that we're holding our elected leadership to delivering on that. But we also know, again, that we have the immediate issue of dealing with train safety. And so, Glenn, I want to come back to you and ask, you know, in the aftermath of the derailment, we heard several times that Norfolk Southern broke no laws. So this suggests sort of that the present railway safety regulatory environment is less than ideal, particularly in the context of protecting the public. So what are the key issues contributing to the safety vulnerabilities that led to what we saw 6 months ago?
The fact that Norfolk Southern broke no laws is the problem. Corporate greed and regulatory failure have again put the public at risk. And I will use East Palestine's derailment to illustrate the problem, because that derailment was also entirely avoidable. To best understand what I just said, we must start by following the money. The New York Times recently revealed that railroads donated $454 million to our US congressional representatives over the last 2 decades. What the railroad got from our government was an easing of existing safety rail regulations in return for the railroad's promise to responsibly self-regulate. We now know that this experiment in trust has failed. As surely as the Norfolk Southern train left the tracks and damaged the lives and the livelihood of everyone in the East Palestine area, we are vulnerable to an increasing number of epic derailments because of self-regulation and the adoption by Norfolk Southern of the precision scheduled railroading business model known as PSR. Now, that business model requires strict on-time departure and arrival. It's premised on 30 to 40% cut in staff, including locomotive engineers, maintenance, and inspectors. What could possibly go wrong? In the rail yards, it means a grab and go, unsafe assembly of rail cars, whatever's ready before the departure deadline. The East Palestine train was unsafe because it was 151 cars long, or 1.76 miles, and heavier rail cars were assembled behind empty rail cars. When the Civil War era air brake system was applied on that train, the front of the train was braked, but the signal to stop, which travels back car by compressed air, had not yet reached the heavier cars in the rear, pushing the empty cars off the track. Norfolk Southern chose not to use electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, which will stop a train 40 to 60% faster. That safety measure is possible because an electronic brake signals travels from the front to the rear at the speed of light. Recall also that East Palestine derailment was caused by a rolling stock wheel bearing failure that can happen in your backyard, anywhere. National Transportation Safety Board Chair Hamady said that the derailment was entirely avoidable. She said that in a few days after the derailment. And that's because a wheel bearing that is about to completely fail visibly leaks oil and could have been discovered with inadequate inspection. At that point, the train would have been pulled out of service before it left the yard. The problem here is that while Norfolk Southern touts safety, behind closed doors, they promote profits over prudence. And we know this because of what was said behind closed doors based on a complaint that was filed in U.S. District Court for Western Pennsylvania. The whistleblower lawsuit was filed on behalf of Russell Puzowski, a Norfolk Southern locomotive engineer for 21 years, working out of the company's Conway rail yard in Beaver County. A couple of quotes from the complaint. During a 3-month period, engineer Puzowski discovered 40 federal safety rule violations that took these trains carrying on board hazardous materials out of service or delayed their departure. Puzowski was told that the local management team could no longer tolerate the delays because it was causing them to get their asses chewed out by their superiors, unquote. And that on-time departures was more important than adequate pre-departure inspection. Puzowski says he was fired for caring and taking too much time to inspect hazardous trains, without regard to the outcome of his lawsuit, which is still pending. The rest of the engineers and inspectors get the message. This kind of pressure is happening at rail yards all over the country. That East Palestine train passed through 3 rail yard inspections before getting to your town. Let's see what else the railroad lobby's payments to our politicians brought them. Railroad companies are currently allowed to decide for themselves whether to use hot box detectors, how far apart to place them, and what temperature trigger to set to signal a stop the train alarm. They can determine safe load limits, how far down to wear their rails and wheels, inspection times, maintenance schedules, and engineering standards for rail bridges. They can forego installing more advanced wheel bearing failure detectors on the wheels and disregard stop the train alarms. What is clear is that when railroads self-regulate and cut corners, whole communities will suffer for decades.
Thanks, Glenn. You know, you gave us a lot to chew on there, and I wrote down a figure because I want to make sure I got this right. $455 million was how much the railroad industry has donated to political campaigns.
Yep.
Well, all right. So the cynical in me, the cynic in me will say, you know, that doesn't leave a lot of optimism for some of the policy proposals that we've heard so far, but let's give it a spirit due. So my next question is really about that. And so due to sort of many of the vulnerabilities you mentioned, we saw that both the US senators from Ohio and Pennsylvania introduced the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act of 2023. Can you tell us a little bit more about that proposed legislation? You know, does it move us closer to the regulatory environment that we need? And what are some particular areas where it might fall short?
Sure. The Railway Safety Act would strengthen inspection and safety requirements, such as mandating that a hot box detector scan trains carrying hazardous materials every 10 miles, would require rail carriers to provide advance notice to state emergency response officials about what they're transporting, would authorize $27 million for the Federal Rail Administration to research and develop stronger tank car safety features, and it also increases fines for safety violations and funding for training. It's a start, but it stops short of dictating major regulatory changes, instead leaving the Federal Rail Administration to do the drafting, implementing, and to administer the act. Now, while that might sound reasonable to the general public, rail workers and their unions know better. They have zero confidence that the FRA is going to act in the public interest because they know that agency is administered and staffed by former railroad and petrochemical executives and lobbyists who have a long history of subverting rail safety, issuing waivers, and serving the rail industry's agenda. For example, the union president from one of the biggest rail unions said, the loopholes in this bill are so big you could run a freight train through them. The Bipartisan Act also does not address other critical issues, such as lower train speeds, train length, electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, and a broader definition of what is considered a high hazard flammable train subject to stricter federal safety regulations. Now, this last point needs to be explained because it's important. The East Palestine train was exempt from such requirements, even though there were 20 cars carrying hazardous material. That is because the regulations currently written by the FRA say 20 contiguous hazardous rail cars. Whistleblowers will tell you this is a joke. They get around the rule by just putting a few empty cars between the 19th and 20th hazardous rail cars, and that's why the East Palestine train didn't qualify. Now, the bipartisan act is out of committee and pending on the floor of the Senate. Ohio Senator Vance is one of the sponsors of this bill. His legislation originally committed to quickly end hazardous material shipments in antiquated, unjacketed, prone to puncture DOT 111 tank cars, which regulators determined had failed at a higher rate during the East Palestine derailment than updated fortified tank cars on the same train. The initial Railway Safety Act had proposed that these 1960 era designed unsafe at any speed tank cars be removed from the nation's rail system entirely by May 2025. Senator Vance quietly amended his own legislation, and this is what Senator Muth was referring to, in order to delay the tank car enhancement deadline from May 2025 to December 2028. This was a purposefully sneaky way to make an amendment because it wasn't accomplished the way usual amendments are, but by a less transparent means known as an amendment in the nature of a substitute, in which an entirely new bill replaces an entirely pre-existing bill. And you'd have to go through it word by word to see how he delayed implementation. When called upon to explain the delay to 2028, Vance claimed, well, the rail industry needed more time. However, I found that in 2015, Railway Age reported that the largest builder of tank cars stated, quote, it is possible to address unjacketed DOT cars in the unit train crude oil service in as few as 2.5 years. Now, that delay that Vance implemented makes sense for the members of the American Chemistry Council because upgrading to newer and heftier tank cars means higher shipping costs for their members. And after that amendment passed, quiet amendment passed, Senator Vance touted the American Chemistry Council's support for the bill, without mentioning that the rail and chemical lobby groups had backed the change to the tank car date rules. Vance, whose home state is nurturing a growing petrochemical industry, is one of the Senate's top recipients of chemical industry cash. I'm telling you that if we don't get a handle on this right away, what we will have is a Norfolk nightmare coming soon to a neighborhood near you. In closing, considering that with each passing train, the rail operators are playing Russian roulette with you, they are spinning the cylinder with every train that passes, and we are literally dodging bullets. I have known for sure, and now everyone knows, that Norfolk Southern's complete arrogance and disregard for the safety and health of people is what drives our grassroots campaign. R3P encourages communities to use their voice to contact federal and state officials, because the more of this that happens at every level, the more difficult it will be for elected leaders to serve polluters instead of their constituents. We're putting a list of action items in the chat and a link for you to connect to RP3's website and sign up for future rail policy reforms, safety, and health information. If there's one thing that I've learned in my old age, is that you cannot underestimate the power of what a community can do when they stand together. We all deserve power without pollution and energy without injustice. Thank you.
No, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for giving us opportunity to already sort of take action. I know there's a lot of passion that's been building from this conversation. So I just want to point everybody to the chat. There's some actions coming in there. If you're sort of motivated as I am from Glenn's perspective, please do take note of those. So we're getting close to the Q&A portion of this conversation. So I do want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have a question, please do make sure that you get it in the chat so that way we can capture it. For my next question, I want to go back to Senator Muth and just say, you know, the tenets of environmental justice to which I think we can sort of place the train derailment within that context have taught us that no one knows what the community needs better than the community itself. And so, you know, you alluded to this a little bit earlier in your remarks, but how can we support government decision makers in following through on the ongoing engagement that actually delivers sort of the long-term relationship building and community capacity that actually allows communities to have a significant seat at the table?
Sure. So I think the part I don't like about this question, and it's probably because you're also kind, is like, how can you help support legislators? But really, I feel like we should be asking, how do we get legislators to support all of you? And so I think my perspective is that in order to get people to be heard and have legislators come into impacted communities, you know, I don't represent parts of the state, but I've filed lawsuits against bad things about to happen to a community because whoever represents them doesn't care. And so I feel like wherever wrong is being done can happen anywhere else. And so getting legislators' attention, and they do not like negative press. They do not. I work with people who shudder and freak out with any sort of calling out of their bullshit. And it doesn't have to necessarily be aggressive, but hey, so-and-so, we've been inviting you here for however many months, please come and see what our community is dealing with, and just be repetitive and refuse to not be heard. And so it's so frustrating that you even have to do that. But that's the reality of where we are at. And I do believe that part of this is informing our neighbors and our people that I always say, like, I've never assumed anybody's like, I hate like low information voter. I hate that word, that whole term, because it's no one's choosing to have a limited amount of information. The government and corporate polluters and everything else have done a really good job of making sure that that public doesn't have access easily to information of meaning, and greenwashing or completely lying about some of these issues we're talking about. I didn't realize that, like, I learned a lot from some of the train worker union people that said, I was on the phone with Paul he's from Pennsylvania, and with the rail union people. And he was like, I go, so tell me how you detected derailment. He's like, you walk the train. And I was like, excuse me? And I'm envisioning, like, if you drive a car and it says one of your tires has like low air, that there's like a signal on the dashboard of the conductor, like in like just common sense land. That's where I've never been a conductor of a train, but you know, except for the one at McDonald's in Murraysville, Western Pennsylvania, where for my one birthday party, I got to be the train conductor, but that was, you know, not a toxic train. But I don't know what that's like. So using the people that are in their perspective and experience to talk to people, like when I told my dad, called my dad, he still lives in Westmoreland County. I was like, get this, you don't even have to have two people on a freaking train that's a mile long. Like things like that, like really kind of jolt just basics, you know, the basic attention span of like, wait, what? Because really what it is the government has done a good job of making it seem like certain things are illegal, or that the public assumes that they're protected from X, Y, and Z until it happens to them. And they're like, wait, what? You don't care that Pennsylvania is the only state in the nation that doesn't regulate private well drinking water? Is that by design? I'm going to argue yes. I may sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we are one of the most fracked states. So when you hear these things, it's like, I don't ever shame anybody for not knowing them, right? It's just sharing the information we know and growing the outrage that we deserve and demand better. And so Inviting I have one retired teacher from Dimock, Pennsylvania, who has not had clean drinking water in her faucet for 12 years. She sends studies and things all the time to her elected officials. And in Senate hearings, they've said, well, we haven't seen these studies of the harm. And she texts me losing her ever loving mind because she's sent these studies for, years. And it's like, that's where you show up with the binder, print it out, Facebook Live it. Like if people that are elected to serve the public aren't gonna come and meet with the public to hear what they're dealing with, then, that's where you call them out. And we have to do a better job of saying, here's who the cowards are that aren't fighting for the people. They have great health care. They have all these things that people that are impacted do not have access or guaranteed to. And many of the people I work with have no idea what it's like to be a working class person, a person, living in this era of just trying to protect you and your family from the climate crisis. You might not be anti-fracking, but I'm pretty sure you probably don't want your house hit by a tornado or some crazy flood that takes it out. We can all agree on these things. And so really, it's just building the public awareness and saying to legislators, we want you to come and see what we're dealing with. And there may be a few that listen, but ultimately it's to show, well, then you don't get to do this job anymore. You can, we need someone who's going to fight for us.
Thank you for that, Senator, and I really appreciate those power building strategies that you share with us. And so, Jackie, I want to take that, and see how do we use that at the federal level. So Glenn sort of told us, sort of where we're making some progress, but also there's still some growth opportunities as it relates to improving railway safety. But for you, I want to talk a little bit more expansively about sort of toxic chemicals and ultimately how we sort of address climate change and environmental justice more broadly. How do we sort of leverage some of these power building strategies to deliver good solutions? Are there any policies out there that we should be keeping our eyes on that'll sort of move us closer to where we want to be, that we can sort of take our new tactics and apply to?
I mean, I think it's a couple of things, right? I think we're at a prime moment now in terms of the climate is actually changing and people are experiencing that in very real ways, right? And we also have the science to understand why the planet is changing, right? Over-reliance on fossil fuels, over-reliance on petrochemicals, right? There has to be a transition to clean and truly green energy, right? Those are all very real things that people, regardless again, political affiliation or urban versus rural, are feeling them in some sort of way, be it just the heat outside and the temperatures or the flooding, etc. And I think at the federal level, I would echo similar to what my esteemed colleagues have said, the power still is very much in the people, right? And even on the federal level, both senators and congressional people aren't necessarily comfortable with conflict outside of the Senate and the congressional floors, right? When it comes to actually facing the folks that vote for them, they tend to trend in spaces of folks who share very similar opinions with them. So it is an imperative of us to continue to put the pressure on them, to hold them accountable, but also to support policies that are coming forward, right? And a lot of my work right now on the federal level is with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And making sure these billions of dollars actually get to disadvantaged communities, communities kind of on the front line of environmental justice, right? But that is both a federal and a state level activity in terms of the federal, making sure that they have the processes in place to streamline that money to the states, and states, once they get it, to actually do the work, right? But also to make sure that there is active community engagement and participation, because I think one of the things that was mentioned kind of earlier here is that the folks who are living in communities are the best folks to decide the future of their communities, right? Based on both where they are now, the historical context, all of that. And a lot of my role, right, and the reason why I'm constantly bringing constituents through my budget to DC is the whole conversations about it's not me, it's not Jackie, right? Jackie is using, resources as a 50c3 to make sure that these folks, their voices are actually heard by policymakers in terms of what they imagine their futures to be particularly communities, where I'm from in Southwestern Pennsylvania, that have been heavily impacted by the gas shell development industry. and folks in like West Virginia, just all across the state. Like I'm not limited to a geographical area. I just happen to be based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So that is my reality. So I would say right now, particularly, and as we gear up till 2024, which is a big election year, all across the ballot. Again, I feel like people vote people voice their opinions with their vote. But also in between that time, how they show up in terms of writing letters, in terms of making phone calls, in terms of sending emails, and just to some extent, as my grandma used to say, being a pest, but like a good pest, in terms of like there is no tomorrow, like in terms of the 10-year plan really is like a 5-year plan, like, right? Like we are in dire straits now, and there is not any time to be wasted. And that includes both on the state level, but also on the federal level too. And getting in where you fit in. But also, I also like to say, as somebody who is in this work and is in this work every day, day in and day out, it's also, you got to give yourself time for rest and reflection too. Like it's important for like self-care, because this work can drive you crazy and it can make you very upset and angry. And I think that our movement that we are building together across party lines has to be rooted in hope. And it has to be rooted in the belief that we as a people can come together to save both ourselves and this beautiful planet that we inherit.
Thank you, Jackie. That's beautiful, beautifully said. Where does the time go? We only have four minutes left. I do have one more question for you all. But before I do ask that, I just want to make sure that I recap some of my key takeaways that I'm going to take away from this conversation. So one, the Inflation Reduction Act, there seems to be an immediate opportunity to sort of do some sort of civic engagement there, to really making sure that we're leveraging those investments and making sure that we're responding to the climate crisis and delivering environmental justice appropriately. Glenn and his organization shared some of the immediate activism we could do around the Railway Safety Act of 2023 in terms of closing some of those loopholes. And then Senator Moof told us about how important it is to get money out of politics. With that figure, I can't get out of my head that Glenn shared of $455 million from the railway corporations to politicians. So it's a lot of work for us to do in the policy and in the electoral space. But what the audience is really curious to hear about, and this is my last question to the panel, is that what do you think can be done outside of policy and electoral solutions? Are there things that we haven't covered that maybe we should be keeping our eye on? And with this, I'll go to Jackie. I'll go to you first.
I mean, I'm always saying something of, I always say like, your vote is your voice, but also your money is your choice, right? In terms of where you are expending your funds on an everyday basis, right? And so even, you know, in my own work, I am always encouraging folks to think about where you are spending your money, what you are donating to, be it like a nonprofit. And it's like, my mom, who is 74, you know, when she gets her Social Security check, she has a lineup of a little nonprofits that she donates. It's $5 to every month, right? And I laugh at her, but I say it's the same thing, like that. You get 10,000 senior citizens to send $5 a month. You're doing pretty well, like it's like a nonprofit. So I say, like, don't ignore like the realities of what causes you support. Be clear about like supporting them, right? Both with like your voice and with your dollars. And in terms of when you go to the store, just understanding to the degree possible. And as the senator said, like most things in terms of chemicals in the chemical industry weren't designed for the average person to understand when they go to a supermarket or they go into a store and are buying a product, what chemicals are actually toxic to them, because a lot of them are, and you think they're safe. But to the degree you continue to educate yourself, and as you spend your money, you find the safest alternatives for you and your family, and continue to do that and advocate that and spread that message. Those are just little things that you can do.
Awesome, love it. Glenn, what about you? What are things we could do outside of policy and electoral solutions?
It's really simple. We need to decarbonize because climate change is here and now with respect to our national rail system. Just Google sun kinks, and that's deformed rails as a result of the heat. And there have been 2,100 derailments as a result of sun kinks on the rails. And the way the extreme heat affects the rails, it also affects our bridges. And if you look around this country, rail bridges aren't painted. They're not maintained because the rail companies will come back to the States, tell you 3 years before they fail that these need to be replaced on an expedited basis from a safety perspective. And in Pennsylvania, they get an RTAP grant and they get a new bridge at a 70% discount. And so our rail system is about to fail because of the extreme heat, the water flooding, and the extreme cold. And if you think, people have said this morning, well, derailments are going to continue to happen. You think East Palestine was a problem? Next 10 years, we're going to have apocalypses all over this country. And so what we need to do is decarbonize, because we cannot build our way out of this. Our national rail system cannot be rebuilt in a way that's safe. And we need to keep the heat down.
Love it. Love it. Appreciate it, Jacquelyn. All right, Senator, last word is yours. Any insights for us of what we can do outside of policy and electoral solutions?
It's a hard one for me because my life is embedded in this, whether I don't want to be a senator when I wake up or not. But I think the youth is somewhere to start. Some of my favorite constituents to meet with who certainly can't vote for me yet are Girl Scouts, some of the youth groups that are really environmentally aware. And I was a Girl Scout, and that's how I learned to take care of streams and protect nature and all these things. But our younger generations are actually really well informed on the climate crisis. And if there's not curriculum in the school, which is highly unlikely, we have gas and oil coloring books distributed in Pennsylvania schools on the regular. So starting some sort of effort to just get youth engaged on this, because it is their future that's literally on fire right now. And so it kind of gets political, I guess you could say, but I don't think that, again, being able to live a safe life should be a political thing. But I think if you're overwhelmed by all of this, it's normal. It's good to take a break, but it's also, I saw in the chat, supporting one another and having an organized effort is helpful because it allows people to take breaks, because we all are going to need a break. And the goal of industry and shitty government is to burn us all out. And it is very easy. I admittedly in the last 2 months have been in this epic funk of just being surrounded by coward Democrats and crappy Republicans, and just like, what is my role in this space? And like, why am I even doing this? Like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, because it feels heavy, and it's like, people don't have water, and how do we get, like, how do you do? So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to start small. If that's what I have to do is send money for a case of water, then like, that's step one. And like, what else? Right. And teach yourself. And I think, again, the more we can create public awareness, educate, like I'm always like, watch this documentary, read this book. Did you watch Dark Waters, which blew my mind? Like, documentaries that are about these things so that people have other resources to reference. I hand out the Amity and Prosperity book. If you haven't read it, you need to. Literally, I buy it used on eBay. And now I've met Eliza Griswold, the author, and I adore her. But I read that book, bawled my eyes out. As a lifelong resident of Western Pennsylvania who grew up in Westmoreland County, moved to grad school in Arizona when the boom of fracking began, and came back and there was frack pads next to my elementary school, and it was bananas. And so like I buy it on eBay and I hand it out to senators for Christmas gifts. I gave one, the secretary of the DEP, Secretary Negrin, when he first met with me, said, don't worry, I heard you want everyone to read this book. And then I saw him 3 months later, and he opened up his phone and showed it to me on Audible, and then he also had a hard copy. And I said, I just thought if I became the secretary of the DEP, what would I want to know? And I think that book does a great job of showing you what you're up against. So Amity and Prosperity, Sarah, that's what it's called. And it's a true story, and it's about government failure and corporate greed. And so there's ways to make this entertaining and have events and to educate the public and our neighbors. just to make us all more informed, and to again, as Jackie said, that we need to hope keeps us all like vibrant and upbeat, and like we need to be hopeful, but we're going to march forward together, and that's the strongest way possible, and it's truthfully the only way possible. And if it weren't for $5 donors, I wouldn't be sitting here as a senator right now, that I had them in all 50 states, including, God bless the lady from Alaska, gave me $10. So again, there is power with the little people. It's rare, but it's totally doable, and what more worthy of a fight than the one that we're in right now.
Thank you, Senator, and Glenn and Jackie. Thank you all. I know I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. So really, thank you for being here.